All right, let's dive right into what is absolutely the greatest ideological conflict in human history, the centuries long tug of war between science and religion. This is a massive, fascinating story all about power, fear, and honestly, humanity's desperate search for answers in a totally chaotic universe.
To really wrap our heads around this conflict, we need to connect the ancient religious worldview with modern 21st century bureaucracy. Think about it. If you read the fine print in your property insurance, you're going to spot this exact term, an act of God. It's actually wild. In a world where we're literally landing rockets on ocean platforms and editing DNA, we still legally blame the heavens for a ruined roof or a flooded basement. It kind of makes you wonder, right? Why do we instinctively fall back on this ancient worldview the second disaster strikes?
To guide us through 500 years of this history, here's our roadmap tracking our transition from the Dark Ages to modern transhumanism. We're going to cover the monopoly on meaning, the battle for the skies, opening the sacred vessel, evolution's trauma and eugenics, gods from a test tube, and finally, the new tech religion. Starting off with Section 1, Monopoly on Meaning. You know, early humans desperately needed a structured system to explain sudden, devastating tragedies. The world was just terrifyingly unpredictable for them. So religion stepped in and offered this incredibly comforting framework, the idea that even the worst tragedy has a divine reason, and your suffering actually earns you spiritual salvation. But then science comes along and completely replaces that comforting divine meaning with cold, random biology. A ruined crop? No longer a punishment for your sins, just a random locust swarm. A sudden illness? Not part of some grand cosmic design, just microscopic bacteria. Science essentially stripped away the why, which naturally alienated a lot of people. Moving right along to Section 2, Battle for the Skies. Now, what's really fascinating about this next shift is how the cosmos itself lost its sacred status. Over the 16th and 17th centuries, things escalated incredibly fast. In 1543, Copernicus dethrones Earth from the center of the universe. Boom. Then, by 1609, Galileo proves the supposedly divine moon is just covered in craters, basically just a giant, dirty rock. And things got intensely political in 1632 when Galileo published a text that, well, essentially insulted the Pope's intellect. But then, by 1655, Giovanni Cassini literally turns a cathedral in Bologna into a massive optical observatory to track the planets. So here's the crucial point. The Vatican didn't just blindly fight scientific progress with pitchforks and torches. Not at all. They acted a lot like a modern tech monopoly. They absorbed these scientific advancements and hired the best astronomers to perfectly calculate massive logistical networks, tax collections, and complex Easter schedules. They essentially weaponized astronomical data to maintain absolute control over the masses. Which brings us to Section 3, Opening the Sacred Vessel. Shifting our focus from the skies down to our own skin, this new scientific curiosity built some serious cultural tension. For centuries, the religious view held that the body was a sacred vessel, basically on lease from God until the Last Judgment, meaning it had to remain completely intact. But scientists needed to see the body as a complex biological machine full of pumps and filters. Anatomists quickly realized they couldn't figure out human biology by just staring at pig or dog organs, which, amazingly, is what they'd been doing for millennia. They desperately needed to look under the hood of a real human. And because of that, the history of modern anatomy is shockingly grim. The massive demand for fresh bodies in medical universities birthed an absolutely terrifying black market. Enter the resurrectionists. These were criminals digging up fresh graves. And get this, they used wooden shovels to quietly avoid the clink of metal against stone in the dead of night. Families were so terrified that they built these heavy iron cages called mort safes right over the graves of their loved ones. The desperation for pristine anatomical specimens got so entirely out of hand that by 1828, men like Burke and Hare were literally committing murders just to supply fresh corpses to doctors. But as dark as it was, this brutal pursuit of biological knowledge eventually saved lives. 400,000. That is the staggering number of Europeans killed every single year by smallpox before Edward Jenner created the first vaccine. But of course, this medical miracle caused massive public outrage. Because the vaccine was derived from cowpox, early anti-vaxxers and theologians called it a satanic pollution of God's holy vessel using animal dirt. That leads us directly into Section 4, Evolution's Trauma and Eugenics. As medicine learned to save the physical body, a brand new scientific revelation struck a fatal blow to human exceptionalism. Charles Darwin wrote these haunting words in 1844. It is like confessing a murder. He knew exactly what his mechanism of natural selection meant. It effectively killed the comforting idea of a divine intentional architect, proving to the world that we are merely surviving primates who just happen to win a genetic lottery. And honestly, this revelation opened a dark and truly terrifying door. Once humanity accepted that we were essentially animals, some scientists, rationally yet horrifyingly, decided we should selectively breed humans just like livestock. Consider this progression. In 1907, Indiana passes the first forced sterilization law. Fast forward to the 1920s, and you have these fitter families contests at agricultural fairs, where human beings are being judged right next to prize-winning pigs. In 1925, the famous Scopes monkey trial kicks off, not as some grand scientific debate, but as a literal PR stunt for a dying mining town. And then, tragically, in 1927, the U.S. Supreme Court officially legalizes the sterilization of those they deemed unfit. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. That terrifying quote came straight from Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes during that 1927 Supreme Court ruling. It perfectly highlights the chilling consequences of a scientifically optimized society operating completely devoid of ethical or religious compassion. This was a cold, calculated optimization of the human gene pool, and it directly inspired the atrocities we later saw in Nazi Germany. Moving into Section 5, Gods from a Test Tube. Following the horrors of World War II, biology opened a deeply controversial new door, accelerating us straight into the era of playing God. In 1978, the first IVF baby is born outside the mother's body, which totally fractured the theological concept of exactly when and where the soul originates. Then, in 1996, Dolly the sheep is successfully cloned without any male genetic material whatsoever. By 2012, the CRISPR genome editing tool is discovered, and just a few years later, in 2018, the world is absolutely shocked when the first genetically modified human babies are born in China. So let's break down this surprisingly cheap and accessible molecular Photoshop known as CRISPR. It's actually a pretty straightforward process. First, guide RNA precisely locates the target genetic mutation. Second, the Cas9 protein acts as a pair of molecular scissors to literally cut the DNA spiral. And finally, the genetic error is discarded and replaced with corrected code. We are literally rewriting the fundamental code of life. Now, I really want you to consider why this matters for our future. We are facing a terrifying leap from genetic therapy, which cures terrible diseases, to genetic upgrades, which enhances human traits. This threatens to create a permanent biological class divide driven entirely by capitalist market demand. Think about it. Inequality won't just be about money anymore. It's going to be about who can afford to purchase premium, disease-free, enhanced genes for their kids. Which brings us to our final section, the new tech religion. So, what happens when science, despite all of its incredible miracles, fails to cure our existential dread? Well, it turns out we haven't actually outgrown our need for an all-knowing power. Just think about medieval beliefs, praying in a confessional, waiting for the Last Judgment, seeking heavenly salvation. Now think about our modern tech faith, asking AI for highly personal life advice, eagerly awaiting the singularity, and hoping to upload our consciousness to the cloud. We literally just swapped out priests for tech CEOs and wooden altars for glowing server racks. 2045. That is the exact year futurist Ray Kurzweil predicts we will hit the technological singularity. It's essentially a Silicon Valley version of the rapture. It's this profound belief that we are going to merge with machines, conquer aging entirely, and eventually leave our flawed biological bodies behind for a perfect digital Eden. Ultimately, this whole historical journey shows us a pretty profound truth. Despite wielding incredibly powerful microscopes, nuclear warheads, and revolutionary CRISPR technology, science has completely failed to answer humanity's most primal question, why are we here? Science did a fantastic job dismantling our old myths and explaining the mechanical gears of the universe, but at the end of the day, it left us entirely alone with our profound fear of the unknown. So, I want to leave you with this final thought to reflect on. Will science ever fully replace religion, or will humanity always, on some level, need the irrational? As we map our entire genomes and build these omniscient artificial intelligences, will we ever actually stop creating new gods out of our own technological progress? Keep questioning, keep exploring, and thanks for joining me on this incredible deep dive into our history and our future.